Dr. Dean, thank you for joining us tonight and on this eve of Memorial Day weekend. How long have you lived in Pensacola, or at least this time around?
Well, it's the only time around. Like many people, the Navy brought me here. I came here in 1990 as a flight surgeon. I spent 3 years out at Whiting Field and 3 years at Mainside as a Navy flight surgeon.
And then?
And then I retired and went into private practice.
And what does a flight surgeon do?
Flight surgeon, surgeon is we're not surgeons as in general surgery. We don't operate. It's a military term for military physician. Flight surgeons take care of Army aviators and naval aviators and their families. Aviators are under a lot of stress. They have special restrictions as to what medications they can take. Flight surgeons understand what medications they can take, what medications they can't take, so that anytime an aviator goes to a doctor, he's automatically grounded until he comes back to see the flight surgeon and gets clearance that he's medically qualified to fly again.
So you hold whole careers in your hand?
In a semblance of ways, yes.
So was Pensacola different in the early 90s?
Yes, actually, at that time, Pensacola was sort of slow, very more rural, and it just seemed to have been suspended in time. But since then, it has raced to catch up with the rest of the country.
And you know, when we think of Pensacola in the late 80s, early 90s, we often think of the Brownsville Revival, and also a little later on, the Patriot Movement or the Militia movement. So were you involved in religious affairs during those times? Were you involved in what are called the militias or the self-defense groups?
Well, I was involved with the militia groups here. They were very constitutionally oriented. They weren't, as they were portrayed by the media in many cases. It was basically citizens that were interested in personal freedom and protection of their rights under the Constitution.
So the media loves to over-dramatize what they're always looking for, homegrown extremists. And you're saying the Florida militia movement, was it a group of folks, men and women, who met periodically to discuss certain issues, be they political or be they defense of one's homes? What actually went on? Basically,
home preparedness, food storage was a big thing. We met on a monthly basis at one of the Baptist churches. They were very supportive, and so we had, of course, a lot of the church members who were in the militia. But it was a very family-oriented, more of a preparedness type organization.
So, was there any connection? Of course, there's a lot of Baptist churches in Pensacola, a lot of the sports leagues through the Baptist organizations, a lot of the musical events, camps, early childhood education. But was there a particular reason that Baptists, as folks who have some literal interpretation of the Bible and the end of the world, and like many Christians, is there a reason why the self-preparedness or home defense and Baptist religion or philosophy meshed?
Well, there wasn't anything religious about that related in any way. It was just that the minister of the particular church where we met was a big patriot, believed in the Constitution, and he offered his church as a place where we could have our meetings.
Got it. So it was more a question of venue.
Yes.
And at that time, what church was that?
Crossroads Baptist Church. In fact, the minister was Chuck Baldwin, who was later a presidential candidate for the Constitution Party.
Right, I've heard of him. So I don't think I've heard of Crossroads Church. Is it still in existence?
Yes, it is. But Pastor Baldwin has moved up to Montana.
Okay. And the new pastor is?
I don't know who it is.
Okay. What about, some of the ones that have become bigger now? What about Marcus Point or Olive Baptist? Did they also have, sort of depending on where you lived and all that, but did they also have...
I don't know of any involvement from any of the other churches.
Yeah. Don Camacho was talking about, meeting in people's homes too.
Yes. It was because it was little groups, just like any organization. There was, you've got squads and platoons and companies, and so the smaller groups would usually meet in people's homes.
And what was discussed? Was it more emergency preparedness? Was it also philosophical and political? Was it all of those things?
It was pretty much preparedness.
Right. And we're in an area of the country that sees hurricanes and floods and that sort of thing. So was that part of it, or was more being prepared if there was a internal or external attack? What was
It was more personal and family preparedness for a civil disruption from whatever cause. For example, when we had the hurricane come through here, that showed me how fragile society was. Then after 3 days of no electricity, people were standing in line getting in fistfights over a bag of ice. And we see that the society really has a very fragile structure, that when disruption of some central service, such as water, electricity, things can break down pretty fast.
So I just took a course in Boston on emergency preparedness. And the big emphasis was, know your neighbors. The guy who leaves work 15 minutes before you, make sure you have his name, his phone number, his kids' names, etc. And that's a very big new trend in emergency preparedness. But for those of us that live in urban areas, we're also worried about our neighbors. And we appreciate the positive role that law enforcement or the state can play in our lives. But in an emergency situation, we also worry about their behavior. We've had many examples of that lately.
Yes.
So why don't you comment on some of the things that you said and just kind of get into it a little bit more deeply? Because I got the feeling from Don, I love my neighborhood, but human behavior is human behavior, and they could turn in a minute, and generally I don't worry about violence from the state, but it's federal government can be irrational and unpredictable, as you have witnessed as a witness in the Kenthoven trial. So why don't you state your feelings about all this?
Well, I think that's an area I don't want to really get into.
Okay. So was the Florida militia organized in terms of having cells and some central leadership? Was it kind of more of a decentralized movement?
It was pretty decentralized on a county-by-county basis. And it seemed that just as we were starting to get organized was when the federal government became very antagonistic, and they started arresting people for minimal reasons, and that really pulled the plug on the momentum for the militia, and most of them pretty well disbanded at that point.
They arrested militia members, or they were just...
They did, and there was... I remember one night that I had heard from someone who had connections very high in the government that there was going to be a major crackdown on militia leaders across the country. And one of the congressmen, I forget his name, he actually went into the White House and because he found out about that, and he's the one that stopped the government from going after so many people. But it was that weekend, I remember my wife looked out, heard our dogs barking, and she looked out our back window, and we live on a golf course, and there were 3 golf carts that were parked out across the green. And when she turned the lights on and looked out the window, and she said suddenly they just all drove off. And that was the night that we had heard that they were supposed to be going after people.
So was the crackdown on the Florida militia, or maybe it was national, did it coincide with the Oklahoma bombing? Did it coincide with Waco or Ruby Ridge or any other major historical events?
No, it was actually Waco and Ruby Ridge that were the impetus for the formation of the militias across the country.
That's understandable for Waco, but in Oklahoma, was it because folks were of the opinion that the federal government was involved in the actual bombing?
I'm not sure who actually was involved. There's still a lot of questions on that, but it was after the Oklahoma bombing that the government got serious about going after the militias, and that's pretty much when they dissolved.
Got it. And Don told me that there was kind of a lot of talk amongst here in Pensacola that, well, we have to be more discreet, and we're kind of disbanding, but not really, because we're going more underground and we'll be in touch and that sort of thing. So was there some attempt to keep the connections going and some of the momentum while being a little less visible?
Well, they kept it a secret from me because I didn't think they did. I thought they pretty well dissolved.
And when you got together, what types of activities or training or discussion would take place?
A lot of organization, because we were at that time organizing, recruiting, and then, as I said, self-preparedness, beekeeping, food storage. Food storage was a real big issue.
What about the use of gas masks or flak jackets, or how to maintain or properly use arms? Was this part of it for some people anyway?
Well, for some people it was, but we've got a lot of ranges, public ranges here in town, and so people would get together in little groups and go out and practice on the ranges.
So, in down here in the South and in a place like Pensacola, people basically who wanted to have guns already had them, or
Sure.
was there an uptick? Because Don was laughing because he said, yeah, people used to pressure me to buy more guns, but I already had 37, and if anything happened, I can't carry more than one.
Yeah.
But I mean, was there some of that, Second Amendment or right to bear arms, or?
Well, that was a big part of it.
What was? I'm sorry.
Standing up for the Second Amendment, protecting a citizen's right to keep and bear arms.
So, in terms of self-defense, so food storage and self-reliance and some attention to personal weapons. But how about, philosophically? Was the militia include a lot of people with a lot of differing opinions, or was there?
No, there were people that had very staunch pro-Constitution beliefs, that the federal government was tromping on many of our rights with the Fourth Amendment, the infringements, the push for gun control in many communities in the country. And so that was really what we were doing, was standing up for the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. The Constitution is basically something that puts limits on the government. And I mean, that's what the government is supposed to comply with. And then, of course, the Bill of Rights are what point out to the government the rights that the government is not supposed to trample upon.
So, was there a question of education? In other words, was this stuff discussed?
Oh, education was a big part of it.
I mean,
Absolutely.
were there workshops and, you know, that kind of thing? Were there regular discussions? And some people might have been lawyers and they're talking to other people that are plumbers or electricians. I just, you know, I want to get the sense of how the, you know, how the educational piece took place. So, was that, was the analog technical part, the communications part?
Well, there were people who, he was a communications officer in the Navy, so of course he was very much leaned that way.
So, did you and he, were you neighbors or went to the same church? Did you see him, you know, regularly?
I'd see him on about a monthly basis at the meetings.
And how long did that go on for?
It's probably about, I think, a couple of 2 years.
And who else kind of was influential in this movement for as long as it lasted here in Pensacola?
Well, there was a former congressional candidate. He was the commander, and there were just people from all walks of life.
So, in terms of demographics, in terms of class, it was a mixed movement.
Yes.
And what about religious leaders? So Chuck Baldwin and who else were names that were you know, recognized as having leadership? And
Jim Barnett, he was the commander.
So who was Barnett?
He was the owner of a gun store, but he was also a candidate for Congress.
And Chuck Baldwin?
He was the pastor of Crossroads Baptist Church.
And do you think either of them would be receptive to being, are they both alive? Are they both involved?
I haven't heard from Mr. Barnett in years. I don't know what he's doing, if he's still around. Pastor Baldwin, you could probably contact him. Chuck Baldwin Live is the name of his radio show that is on the internet. You could probably track him down.
Got it. So, if there's any vestiges of the movement today, I learned a new word yesterday called preppers. So, and I heard it once in a religious connotation, the end of the world type of thing. I also heard the term used more just, you know, people who are prepared. I heard it connected to the raptures and the revelations. So can you explain to me what a prepper is?
I'm not really sure. I've just seen mentions of the preppers on television like a lot of other people, and there are people who are doing a lot of what the militia was doing, basically family preparedness, food storage, ownership of firearms and protection of the right to keep and bear arms. I think getting back to who are the militia, you could say they're a combination of the preppers and the Tea Party, because they're mostly, they were a defensive group, pro-Constitution, and that was their general political orientation.
Are the preppers more apolitical? Are they more religious? Is it more of a mixed bag? I mean, again, you've been, you know, just taking in the news, but we don't have preppers in Boston. If you watch the news and have some idea, you know more than I do.
Well, that's why we're not in Boston. We believe in independence and liberty in the South.
So do you think that the prepper movement is pretty much the same as the militias, or maybe a little bit less political? Or
no, I think it's probably less well organized.
Was part of the reason that the Florida militia was organized was because in Pensacola there are a lot of ex-military, retired military who are used to being organized, despite being spread out geographically and, chain of command and all this stuff?
I think that may have been a part of it because there were a lot of ex-military people in the militia.
So again, the context for a lot of these questions is Don Camacho, and he's significant because he was the lone juror that, held out for his beliefs. In what context did you know or were you acquainted with Don Camacho?
Well, we were in the militia together. I knew we had a lot of common background, both being retired military officers. I also knew that he was a Sunday school teacher. I had some friends that were in his Sunday school class, and they all spoke very highly of him, but I didn't really get to know him on a real personal basis.
And the fact that he was a Mustang and the fact that you were a West Pointer?
Well, a Mustang is somebody who is a former enlisted person who somehow goes to officer candidate school or is granted a commission and becomes an officer. And I've always respected the Mustangs that I've known. They were always just very upright, upstanding guys.
And your background or your path to being a commander, was that more classical?
No, mine was actually atypical because I was originally in the Army. I went to West Point, then I was 6 years in the infantry. I got out and went to medical school, came back in the Army Medical Corps for 7 years, and then I got out again. I was in private practice for 5 years, and then I transferred from the National Guard into the Navy. So I had a very atypical path.
Okay, so while we're on the subject of social movements, what's the relationship between the militia and the sovereign citizen movement that we got some exposure to during the trial from Mr. Hansen, and the tax protester movement, which was kind of a label that some people have thrown on Kent Hovind? So did the militia tend to adopt the philosophy of the tax protesters or the sovereign citizen, or was that some militia members? Can you tell us about that?
Well, I would say those are completely separate issues because many of the militia people had no knowledge of tax law. Those of us that were in what I prefer to call the tax honesty movement have diligently studied tax law. And I will let you know there is absolutely nothing wrong with the tax laws as written. I support them 100%. The problem is that the government misapplies the laws and does not follow their own laws and regulations.
And what's the fair definition of the sovereign citizen movement, and was there a relationship between the sovereign citizen movement and the Florida militia?
Well, I don't think there is a sovereign citizen movement. Sovereign citizens is essentially a misnomer, and it's again been twisted by the media into something that essentially does not exist. And I think that we were talking about Mr. Hansen's testimony, and I think he never claimed to be a sovereign citizen. The government, of course, threw that term around just as they throw the term tax protester around. I don't protest taxes. I wish the government would comply with the law. So I think the use of the term sovereign citizen is a misnomer. None of us are truly sovereign, even though it goes back to a Supreme Court case which refers to us, the citizens, as sovereigns without subjects, meaning we are all free men.
Okay, and that's a concept that would generally be supported by folks who had the militia mentality?
Some.
Right. So it wasn't necessary.
It wasn't a universal thing, and again, I sort of object to the term sovereign citizen because usually it's a misnomer and the term is misused.
And somewhat pejorative?
Yes.
Okay. Why were you interested in attending some of the this new trial of Kent Hovind, number one? And number two, what's happened in the last 56 or 72 hours, and what's your interpretation of what's happened? It looks like he'll be coming home August 9th.
On schedule.
On schedule. So, and I guess then he'll be going through probably the same 2 or 3 year federal parole status.
Well, they don't have parole. They have probation. Probation. They have supervised release.
Are there limits on your travel?
We have to have approval by our probation officers. If we travel out, we have to notify them if we're going to travel outside. For me, it was the Northern District of Florida, and I assume it will be the same for him. But if we're eligible to get a passport, we could be approved for overseas travel.
So, in an ideal world, will this have any negative impact on his ability to evangelize for creationism?
I don't believe so.
And that's not really the intent of the probation. It's more like keeping tabs as opposed to being all that restrictive.
Yes.
There's another rumor flowing around that he'll have to get a W-2 job. Did you have any of that sort of restriction, or?
They don't like you to go to work for yourself, and they like you to be working for someone else.
Well, you have an exciting alternative medicine practice. Aren't you working for yourself?
I'm working for someone else.
So in terms of the way you get paid, it's a normal payroll service,
yes.
Or an internal, so
I get paid by my employer.
Okay. So do you think that, can you imagine Kent Hovind getting paid by an employer or in someone else's employ?
Sure, I could see his foundation providing him with a job.
So is that what you expect to happen, that he and his son will work together or somehow have different territories? I'm
not sure. I haven't discussed that with either of them.
Right. Everything is so new, and the news has been less. I'm curious. I have great respect for Eric Hovind. I think he's a wonderful young man and very entrepreneurial.
So he could hire his dad.
Right. Since there's egos involved,
yes.
And the usual son-father thing, it's could be a little problematic, but I'm sure they'll work it out. So, tell us what you think has gone on in the last few days and what your feelings are about it.
Well, I'm not sure. I'm learning this from you because I had followed Dr. Hovind's case up through his trial, and after that I got busy running my practice, and so I hadn't gone back and looked at the docket. So I wasn't aware that he had settled.
According to what was pulled off of Pacer, first he was acquitted on fraud, conspiracy, the remaining counts.
Okay.
And there was an issue whether it was dismissed without prejudice or with prejudice. Tiffany Eggers had asked for an extension. Judge Rogers had said no, we got to go to trial. Tiffany withdrew the charges. And then, for a bonus for Kent, the contempt charge was dismissed. So,
well, that's good news, because I was afraid they could keep him for a long time with that.
So now that you know the news, and I think I've done an accurate job in terms of the chronology, what's your reaction?
Well, I'm tickled to death to hear that, because I knew on a contempt charge the sentence could be whatever the judge decides. And if that's been waived, then I'll be glad to see him getting out. I don't think he, of course, should never have gone to prison in the first place.
So, why did you join us at the trial? I mean, His trial, his first trial was 2007 or 2006?
2006.
Yeah. And was that when your trial was?
Mine was in 2005. And I knew Dr. Hovind before. We had different issues, but I supported him, and I believe he supported me. I think we were both not guilty of committing any crime, but I learned that that doesn't make any difference. If they want you, they're going to get you. And shortly after I wound up at Softly prison camp here in Pensacola, several months later, Dr. Hovind showed up. He was there probably about 3 or 4 months, and then suddenly he disappeared, and that seemed to be his condition throughout his imprisonment, was that he was probably had more diesel therapy and transfers from prison to prison than just about anybody I know.
He was bust, that's for sure. No one would argue. How did you know him from prior to your incarceration and his? Did you know each other from social religious circles?
Yes.
Was he a member of the militia movement?
No, but I knew of him through his creation evangelism, and then we became, when we found out that we were both involved with the IRS, we became pretty good friends.
When did you become friends? I mean, roughly what period?
This would probably been in the early 2000s.
And so, how did you discover him? Did you visit Dinosaur Adventureland? Did you watch some of his famous lectures? Particularly, I think number 5 or 6 had to do with the evolution.
You know, I don't really recall.
It's a small town.
Yeah.
And, people with these kinds of beliefs.
We probably had some mutual friends.
When was the militia movement strongest and most organized? When was the heyday of the militia movement in Pensacola?
In the mid-90s, from the Waco Ruby Ridge time period up through Oklahoma City.
Okay, and when did you first meet Kent Hovind?
It was sometime during that period.
Did you encourage him to come check things out, or was he in his own Bill Nye the Science Guy kind of circuit?
I think that's a good description. He did what he made up his own mind about things.
Right, but was he aware of the militia movement?
Oh, I'm sure.
And do you think that any of that had an influence on him, or again was he too strong-willed an individual to really be affected by what some of his neighbors and friends were doing?
Yeah, I don't think the militia movement had any effect on him at all.
So it wasn't part of the underpinnings. And what do you think kicked off his strong animus with the IRS? I mean, my personal opinion was when he was doing some, he really got pissed off when he started pulling some permits when he was expanding Dinosaur Adventureland, and it really got under his skin. And then, from there he kind of, the tax thing balled up. But what was the genesis of his, could we call it tax resistance, or is that?
I really don't know what motivated him in that regard.
So by the time that you got to know him, he was already, had his opinions formulated on the IRS and taxation, et cetera.
Yes, pretty much, because I got started in the late 1990s.
And what kicked off your displeasure?
Well, I was listening to a radio program by a fellow named Irwin Schiff, and Mr. Schiff was an economist and had written a book called The Federal Mafia: How the Government Unlawfully Imposes and Illegally Collects the Income Tax. And he had a standing offer of $5,000 for anybody who could show him a law that made anybody liable for the income tax. And he had an offer of probably $25 to get his book and several tapes, and so I ordered his book and tapes, and since I had always paid my taxes, which I believed I owed, but I wanted to see what he had to say, and reading his book is like getting a master's degree in constitutional law. And I was just overwhelmed with the fundamental truth when I realized that he was right, that there is no law that makes anybody liable for the income tax.
So how many years were you in prison?
7.
And how many years has Kent Hovind been in prison?
10.
And was going to prison for all those years, did it change your fundamental feelings about taxation in the IRS? And do you think it changed Kent Hovind's fundamental feelings about taxation in the IRS?
Well, it certainly didn't change mine, and I doubt if it changed his. What it did educate me in is what the government will do, right or wrong. It's going to get what it wants.
And the fact that you served in the military for as long as you did, that you contribute to society as a physician, that you kept literally the military running through your care and loyalty to jet pilots and fighter pilots and their families. Did that ever once enter into a more lenient sentencing, or?
No, I was sentenced to twice the guidelines, and I was basically given an illegal supervised release sentence. The law requires that periods of supervised release be run concurrently, which means they overlap, and not be run consecutively, but my judge awarded me 2 consecutive 3-year terms of supervised release.
So why was your sentence and Hovind's sentences so long compared to other celebrities we know that get slapped with tax sentences?
Because we both knew that we were innocent, and we fought them every step of the way. At West Point, we stand for duty, honor, country, and after my 24 years in the military, believed that other federal workers who also took an oath to support and defend the Constitution had similar principles. And
so, I'm sorry, but are you saying the harder you fought, the more the government punished you?
Absolutely. And the reason these other people got a slap on the wrist is usually because they pleaded guilty. They made a deal with the government, which Dr. Hovind and I would not do, because we didn't do anything wrong. And so we stood up for what was right, thinking erroneously that at some point either somebody in the Justice Department, the judge, or the jury would realize, hey, he's right, and throw the case out.
So, in retrospect, how do you feel about the role that Don Camacho played?
I think he was an American hero, because the jury is the defendant's last bastion of freedom against the government. And when one person stands up against all those other 11 jurors because of his principles, and in this case, I really respect him for having the courage to do that, because the jury is under a lot of pressure from the prosecutors, from the judge. If they have a problem being hung, I'm sure he probably told you they get counseled by the judge and told to go back in and reconsider, and I'm sure they're harangued by the prosecutor and the federal marshals. Everybody wants a conviction. They don't want the truth. And so for Don Camacho, as the one single standout that held up for his innocence, I have a tremendous respect for him for that.
Do you think that the court system, if they knew that Don Camacho had been involved with the militias or held the beliefs that he believed, do you think he would have been allowed to serve on the jury?
Absolutely not. In fact, in my trial, I challenged the jury, which a defendant has a right to do, and I requested all of the jury selection forms for all the potential jurors. And what we found out after the jury had been selected was that the foreperson of my jury and the foreperson of the grand jury that indicted me, those people had not submitted jury information forms. So the big question that we raised, in fact, we filed a motion at the trial about that, is how did these people even get on the jury since they had not submitted the forms that are required for jury selection? And it's my belief that they probably came out of the Rolodex on the judge's desk, because it's the judge who selects the foreperson of the jury.
So when they saw Don Camacho, Lakeview, good Olive Baptist guy,
Human relations guy.
Human relations, workman's comp, ex-military Mustang, what do you think must have been going through their heads?
They figured he was a ringer, and he'd be just the guy to corral the rest of the jurors and make sure they got a conviction.
And not only that, if you work in public service and mental health, are you more likely to be left-wing or right-wing?
Mostly leftist.
So they thought they had their man.
Exactly.
And were they ever surprised?
Yes.